and we will help Ukraine win.
Okay, will you allow me to go granular again, just because you opened that little Pandora's box? So you highlighted Olaf Scholz, a person who we've discussed here in many interviews with many people and people who've been close enough to him as well. But you, given the fact, I mean, du sprichst Deutsch, so it's easy. You've seen the Süddeutsche Zeitung interview.
I you know what, I actually haven't, but I do. I am pretty well.
Okay, he's clinging. He's clinging to the thought. What you just said. He's clinging to the thought that after Ukraine's victory and after Russia, after an armistice, whatever it is, Germany would still then revert back to find a way to change Russia through trade.
Yeah, I mean, you know, God bless him. I mean, it's a completely wrong geopolitical analysis, and you can explain the reasons for that. In fact, I do to some extent. I mean, I think more generally, this isn't just a Scholz problem. That there is what you might call a mismapping of what happened in the Second World War. In other words, we understand sort of German guilt, collective guilt, but this is sort of somehow transferred to Russia. And of course, you know, many Russians died, but actually the primary territories that were occupied by the German army were Belarus and Ukraine. I mean, they were occupied. I mean, the horrors of Babin Yar, that the execution of the Jews of Kiev, that all took place in Ukraine, and as I said, you know, the Russian regime is essentially an ultra-nationalist fascist regime, you know, and so you cannot deal with it, you cannot trade with it. The place where we're at, and I think, you know, Scholz or her successor will probably recognize this eventually, is we have gone back to the future, in the sense that the only realistic policy is one of containment. That once Ukraine wins, we have to contain, as in early Cold War times, as in the Long Telegram, as in George Kennan, we've just have to contain Russia and make it clear that if they try any more of these kind of misadventures, there will be a hard response, because Putin, you know, he doesn't care about words of condemnation. He doesn't care about resolutions in Brussels or the German Parliament or whatever. He only really understands power and the application of force. So the force has to meet force, and it's not that I'm being hawkish. That is just the reality that we're now in. You know, 10, 11 months into this horrendous war, that Russia essentially has to be contained and stopped.
Luke, thank you very much for saying this, because you must have been listening, you know, undercover to the MriyaReport and to our crew, because we've been advocating this, like you, since March, that the ultimate solution will end up in some form of armistice, and then Russia needs to be contained, because you cannot make peace and trade with them. That's impossible. It won't happen. It will take long. It's very interesting. And by the way, everybody, if you haven't yet read Luke's book, you should. Invasion: Russia's Bloody War and Ukraine's Fight for Survival. Absolutely worthwhile reading. It's a gripping account, lots of good anecdotes, and a clear red line in it. Absolutely recommend it. Please do give him a hand in that regard.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, what can I say? I mean, I mean, like authors always want people to read their books, but I think it's
so topical. Come on.
Well, I think I mean, I've written a lot of books, sort of eight or nine, but this I think is the most important. And what I was trying to do in it was not to foreground myself. You know, I'm just the observer, but to present, as well as the geopolitics, the human stories of some of the people who have been caught up in this tragedy, and to write with passion and moral clarity, because I understand what's going on, and I understand the threat that Russia poses. So yeah, I mean, do read my book. I mean, certainly from the I've given quite a few talks since it came out a couple of weeks ago, including one recently at the Ukrainian Institute in London, and the support I've had from Ukrainians, some of them refugees, some of them kind of long-term residents, has been phenomenal. And you know, it's sometimes kind of tearful conversations that we've had. And one other thing just to say about the book is that it's going to be published in the Ukrainian language, in depending on the electricity situation, but over the next few months, by Vivat, which is a terrific publisher in Kharkiv. So if you have any kind of Ukrainian friends, that might make a present for them as well.
I think it will be very well received. That would have been, by the way, my next question. When will it come out in Ukrainian? But there you go. Look, another thing as to the containment and Scholz on the next, just before we go to questions, I know that there's a couple of hands up and a lot of our friends want to ask questions. The thing as to the Scholz government and their behavior and the likes, you can see that all of Europe wants to move. On Tuesday, our beloved president of Ukraine, Zelensky, goes to talk to the JEF and addresses every single nation and every single prime minister and president, the Latvians, the Finns, the Danes, specifically as to what they like about them, their support, and what they want from them. It's a gripping, very dedicated, very practical, very Ukrainian and very Zelensky speech. And it comes, of course, from an organization which is led by Great Britain. And then in this is one notice where he addresses our Dutch friends. The Dutch who contributed their tanks to the joint brigade with the Germans. The Dutch who led the Germans in tooth and nail and told the Germans they will deliver the Panzerhaubitze 2000 no matter what. Please sign here, Olaf, quite literally. And he addresses them and asks them to make their influence felt and take action to force that release. I found it very interesting that this happens 2 days prior to this visit to the States. I find it very interesting that he yet again takes Mr. Rutte as a, say, solid voice. What do you think is the outcome? Will it work?
Well, I have a question for you. I mean, what do you think is going on here? I mean, you tell me. Because what is the sort of Rutte issue?
I think that the relationship between the Netherlands, the economic relationship between the Netherlands and Germany, has always been so intertwined, so strong, but also delicate. And historically, Dutch governments, especially those conservative-led, have always had significant influence in Germany. And they have a strong voice within NATO. It seems to me that Mr. Rutte is willing to go and say, our tanks have been contributed to this joint brigade. We can deliver spare parts and ammunition to anyone and everyone who releases it. We want them to go, or we take them back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all I can say is Ukraine needs those tanks. The sooner the better. I mean, just an anecdote from the front line. I mean, when I was in Kherson, I was in a Kherson region recently. I was in a newly liberated village called Mykolaiv, and it was a kind of really full-on day. The bridges had been blown by the retreating Russians. To get to Mykolaiv, we had to follow a road across the sunflower field past these newly abandoned Russian positions, and we were very worried about mines. And we, we followed another Russian vehicle and talked to villagers. And when we came out again, there was a Ukrainian column arriving, going straight to the front line, and there was a tank in it. And we had to get out of the way, which was another kind of heart-stopping moment because we were worried about rolling on something which might blow up. But there was only one. And in this cavalcade, there were civilian vehicles which had been painted green, some of them really kind of shonky, that there were transit vans. There were a couple of armored personnel carriers as well. But what you have to understand is that the Ukrainians are winning this war with some Western equipment, but essentially improvisationally, and they need more. They need proper tanks. They need airplanes. They need Patriots. And if they were to get these things, then I think it could all be over pretty quickly.
100%. Luke, we have lots of questions from our audience. I would like to, by the way, also thank our friend Simo, who had reached out to you, and he has a question as well. If you can spare us the time, let's cycle through what our audience has.
Yes. I mean, I can do about another 15 minutes if that works for you and your listeners. Is that all right? Absolutely. Yeah. Then I've got a few.
All righty. Simo.
Yes, hello, Luke, and greetings from Helsinki. Yeah, great to have you here, and it's really something like this book Invasion. Happy to hear that it's also going to be in Finnish language. So that is great. So you're most welcome to the Finnish book fair in October 26 to 29 in Helsinki.
Thank you.
Most welcome. So a couple of comments and questions. So you can pick and choose what you want to comment and so on. But really, it's really amazing what kind of person Zelensky is. Like, if we think there would be like a weaker politician, where would we be? I mean, that he's really something. But really, yeah, this book is a great. It's like reading it. It's like an early Christmas gift for me. So it is wonderful. I wanted to kind of pick your brain on Russian opposition, or so these so-called liberals. You know, they kind of harbor all this kind of tendencies also. So I'm just wondering, what do you think about the position of the so-called liberals, the Russian opposition who fled, you know, and also Khodorkovsky, which I tend to listen more and more when this conflict drags on. But really, many thanks. And really, for us listeners, the thing is, like, we've been following this thing very, very closely for months and months now. So this book really is something that it ties everything together. So it is kind of like a good overview with, of course, thousands of details, but really, really great. And cheers, Luke. All the best.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Russian liberals. I mean, I think it's tricky, and I certainly, I've got plenty of Ukrainian friends who are very critical and dismissive of Russian liberals, and feel that, you know, sometimes they highlight their suffering, which compared to the rolling tragedy and horror of what's going on in Ukraine is nothing. I mean, that's how they see it, and I totally understand why they feel strongly and vehemently. All I would say is that some of the people who've left since March are, for example, Russian investigative journalists that I've worked with before, who are genuine reporters, who we've done anti-corruption stories together. We've investigated Putin's secret fortune, written about the Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers, and have worked on joint projects exposing kleptocracy and the kind of Russian mafia state of the 21st century. And the just from a sort of journalistic point of view, you know, they're no longer in Moscow, and so the country has become almost unreportable, which is a shame, because the good work that we were doing, you know, we can't do anymore. But I you know, put alongside the what's happening in Ukraine, obviously this is kind of minor, but and also it's a little too early to sort of talk about post-Putin Russia, reconstructing Russia. I mean, what has to happen is the Russian army has to be defeated on the battlefield. But at some point, you would hope that the Russian exiles, you know, would think about this question about how Russia can change, how it can move off this track of, you know, aggression and barbarism, and I think I would call it nihilism. How society could be democratized, normalized. I mean, there will be a time for all of these questions, but unfortunately, I think the time is not now.
Very good point. Let's move to Decoding Trolls, who has been with the OSCE beforehand in Ukraine. Decoding Trolls.
Hi, Luke. Thank you very much for your work and undergoing the trauma, which I'm sure you feel and will feel for years. But the result of it is someone is bearing witness to this. I did it myself before February 24th for 7 years with the OSCE, 3 years in the east, in Severodonetsk and Luhansk, and 4 years on the southern part of Zaporozhye. So it affects me deeply when I read, for instance, your accounts of the kinds of people that I met while I was there, the starostas, the village leader you met in Kharkiv, who got punched in the face because he wouldn't put the band on his arm. You know, really, so thank you for that work, and because I trust your judgment on Crimea and all of it, and I also I share your thing about Johnson. Like many, I predicted he'd end up in military uniform. But I never predicted I'd be happy to see him in a military uniform as he was in those exercises the week before he stepped down or was fired. But I sense it in Johnson as well, even after even after he's been demobbed, this apprehension about Crimea, and I suspect you're meeting the people in Ukraine, the kinds of people that I met, and there's no doubt in their minds that Crimea is coming home. And yet I sense, and I heard it here again in you and in Johnson, this slight, there's a slight apprehension. And I just wondered, what is the reason for that? Is that mainly because you doubt the leopard, they'll get the leopards? Mainly you doubt the Western thing, or your knowledge of Russia, you really, it's infinite resources? Or is it?
Yeah. I mean, thank you for your kind and generous comments. And I defer to you. You spent 7 years living in some very tough areas, and at some point we should sit down and have a cup of tea and talk it all through. But in the meantime, I would say with Crimea, I had an interesting conversation with Andrei Zagorodnyuk, the former defense minister, who's writing a piece about Crimea for Foreign Affairs magazine in the US. I'm not sure if it's out yet. And I was sort of saying to him, look, one thing you have to explain, especially to a sort of Western audience, to an international audience, is what would a kind of Ukraine recontrolled Crimea look like? How would that work? Because the point is that Kherson, when Ukrainian troops came in, that they were met with this rapturous reception by crowds. I mean, Kherson is an overwhelmingly pro-Ukrainian city, and the problem in Crimea is that a lot of people who were pro-Ukrainian, they fled 8 years ago. So that pool hasn't entirely gone, but it's mostly gone. At the same time, about 600,000 Russians have relocated to Crimea. They've moved since the annexation. And also the sort of civic group who are most pro-Ukrainian, the Crimean Tatars, have been persecuted, tortured, fitted up, murdered in some cases, and so that community has been kind of greatly weakened. And so the point is, let's say, as a thought experiment, Ukrainian troops cross the peninsula, trundle across the bridges, retake Crimea, Sevastopol, Simferopol, Yalta, etc. How are they going to kind of pacify a population that may be hostile or mostly hostile, and how are they going to avoid doing what Russia has done in areas it has occupied, which is just torturing, murdering, killing, etc. And so I don't quite know what the answers are, but I think if the Zelensky government is sort of serious about retaking Crimea, they also have to think about stewardship, about how they would administer Crimea. I mean, it's always been autonomous. I mean, I've been there a few times before 2014. Beautiful place, interesting place, but in a way, you would